Venken of University of Vienna. So she's going to present a book on Borderland Studies and Children's Studies, a European encounter, where we'll see contributions on children's experiences in Borderlands.
Good afternoon, everybody. So before I start my talk, I would like to make two announcements. The first one is that this, what I represent today, is an edited volume. I am running a 6 years project on Borderland children in Europe, and I'm in the framework of my project titled Conference, and this edited volume is an outcome of that conference. It's accepted for publication. It will come out in 2017 in open access, which means that if you're liking what I'm saying, you could simply download in the near future this edited volume from my personal homepage. And the second announcement I would like to make is that I'm the conference chair of the second World Conference of the Association for Borderland Studies. And that is a conference that will take place in July 2018 in Vienna and in Budapest on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire. So all of you are more than welcome to submit proposals in order to attend that conference. The call for paper is not out yet, the website also not, but on my personal website I will keep you updated about the progress of that conference. And if you look at the list of participants of the first two conference, you see that Southern Europe is a little underrepresented. Now that the conference is going to take place in Vienna and Budapest, there is no reason to leave it like that. Okay. Today I will present the introduction I wrote to this edited volume. So, at the end of both the First and the Second World War, there were imagined visions of Europe that found themselves in the hands of the decision makers at these conferences in Paris. And these imagined visions of Europe, there was always an interrelation between peace, justice, and the need to change borders. And as a result of these negotiations, Europe took the shape of a patchwork of nation states. Now, border scholars have already pointed at the limitations of nationalization and flexibility in identifications among borderlands inhabitants. And in what Predstavitev has called Zwischenräume, it is linguistic, cultural, religious, and or ethnic transition areas, historians have found much contesting going on between national movements, a fact which turns these regions, despite their peripheral location, into central sites of power struggle. In our special issue, we look at the borderlands laying in a ring around Germany, and that were discussed in the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. So you see here the French, German, Belgian German, Danish German, Lithuanian German, loads of Polish German, and Czech German borderlands, and these were lost for Germany after the First World War. Most of them, except from the Danish German borderlands, were annexed again during the Second World War, and after the Second World War were lost again. And we look at the phenomenon throughout the 20th century. So, that's an insight of border scholars. Now, there's also an insight of childhood scholars. Childhood scholars delineated how precisely states express their plans and their programs for children. So, if you want to know what hopes representatives of nation states fostered, you can look at child policies. Now, with reference to the European borderlands, you can say that the children living in these borderlands were envisioned to play a crucial role in bringing about the peaceful Europe that the representatives at the international peace conferences had in mind while changing the sovereignty of their borderlands. And so in the edited volume, we bring together a new combination of categories from different disciplines. You have borderland studies meeting childhood studies in Europe. Europeanization, let's have a closer look at that. So the territorial changes introduced in the international treaties concluded after the First and after the Second World War affected the lives of those living But does this observation alone enables us to say that 20th century Borderland inhabitants experienced Europeanization? Let's therefore look at three approaches towards Europeanization. The first one is used as a way to correct the imbalanced knowledge we possess of the characteristics of nationalization of the European continent. So this is used in order to break down the juxtaposed construction of Western civic nationalism versus Eastern ethnic nationalism. And you have historians who have conducted comparative studies. One of us is that's Bernard Streck, who did some comparative research on borderlands in Europe. But you see that most of these studies still remain within the framework of the big European nations. And there is still a need for elaborated empirical historical studies, comparisons at the regional and local level, also in less studied European eras. So that's the first approach towards Europeanization. The second one is to look at the longer 20th century. So this is an attempt to go against the trend of seeing the emergence and the functioning of an enlarged European Union as a teleological process. And this provides us with the image of what Norman Davis has called a tidal Europe. So a Europe with an ever-changing shore and sea in terms of territory as well as of political, economic and social ambitions. Now, if you look at the Europe throughout the 20th century from such a perspective, what you see is that after the First World War, the League of Nations was established, and it stood there to guarantee the national rights for whole minority groups. But yet, far from holding a universal character, these minority rights designed at French negotiation tables were notably animalistic. Although it affected the majority of the minorities created by the border changes of the World War I, those living in Central and Eastern Europe, Western European states did not have to adhere to any international supervision of the way they treated their minorities. So the whole international setup had therefore something of a civilization mission for the eastern part of the European continent. And this turned out all the more problematic when one of these Western states, Germany, ostensibly started to include anti-Semitism into its state policies and refuted the national categorization of its neighbors by aspiring to the unification of all the people it considered of German blood into one empire. Taking place after the Second World War was that an ethnically clean nation-state was deemed desirable, with minorities being considered a cause of conflict for the state. Now, the international approach towards minorities was enhanced by the geopolitical setup that would dominate European politics over the next 40 years. As conflicts over minorities between nation-states operating either before or behind the Iron Curtain threatens to erode the internal political stability of the bloc during the Cold War, they were brought to a halt. So that is the second approach towards Europeanization. There is a third one. The late Tony Judd did not interpret the 20th century primarily as a clash of barriers, whether democratic, fascist, or communist ideologies, but saw it characterized by the rise of state involvement in all European countries. And especially with regards to children, you see that nationalizing children was a phenomenon characterizing all European political regimes, whether democratic, authoritarian, or dictatorial. And this is something we look at in this special issue. Now, taking together Alsatian orphans during the interwar period. And we have a chapter on this Lithuanian-German borderlands, on children life roles, on the basic basis of eco documents. And then we have a very nice contribution on Alsatian youth movements, and that starts from the period after the First World War, but it goes all the way up to the 1970s, so it's a long-term perspective. Now Beata Halicka looks at the child memoirs in this Polish-German borderlands, and that's also the basis of eco documents. We have Musu, who looks at minority education in German in this Danish-German borderlands after the Second World War. And Andreas Vickers looks at this Belgian-German borderlands, and he looks at regional autonomy and discusses it as a generational phenomenon. Now, taken together, the contributions first and foremost show the complexity of nationalization within various previous undiscovered spheres of borderland children's lives. And the various empirical contributions to this volume, one can detect nationalist practices in their purest form. Yeah. So, for instance, in this contribution about Alsatian orphans, you read how German architects designed a pompous modernist building for orphans in Strasbourg. And it came to function as a demonstrative landmark of progressive hygienistic beliefs. So you see here how Germany brought the best it had over to the borderlands and used social child policy as a weapon in the symbolic battle of modernity. But whereas various national authorities considered also schools the main vehicle to integrate minorities and realize the homogeneous nation states they had in mind, the results of their efforts in schools were at the very best only marginal and often did not meet their objectives at all, either because minorities wanted these schools to play a role in their political emancipation, or because people appeared nationally indifferent. Let us now look at what this edited volume reveals in terms of Europeanization. So, with reference to the first approach, you see that there is not an East and West in this edited volume. Now, evaluating, for example, the way nationalists allowed the German-speaking inhabitants throughout the interwar period to develop their own activities, you will see that the French nationalists were much harsher than Polish nationalists, and Polish nationalists were much harsher than Danish nationalists. So we don't have an East-West divide here. It's not something like an Eastern and Central Europe when it comes to nationalist policies towards children. The second level, the second approach towards Europeanization, this tidal Europe, was speaking of, you see that the requirements of nationalists with regards to children's language teaching in primary schools were harsher after the Second World War than they had been in interwar years. So the idea prevailing by the time that non-dominant groups, instead of nation-states themselves, were endangering the stabilization of peace and order in Europe, found a very clear articulation in school politics. Now, I had the privilege to be the editor of this edited volume, which means that I had a good perspective over the individual contributions. And while I was reading these contributions together, I developed a new hypothesis, and this hypothesis lines up with this third approach towards Europeanization. So if you look at the contribution of this teaching in German in the Danish-German borderlands, you see that in the early 1960s, a German school teaching in German was reopened in the borderlands. So after the Second World War, teaching in German was not allowed, and then they allowed teaching in German again. And there was a ceremony So, Tobias Heine-Monson, the author of this piece, showed how youngsters who were supposed to act as a German-speaking new elite no longer shared the isolationist national convictions of their parents. Adopting a Danish tradition did not threaten their identity, but was considered an asset and functioning in a border region where different cultural spheres meet. Something similar you see in the contribution of Julia Fox about the Salvation youth movement. The first French youth hostels arose in the 1930s, not in the center of France, but in the Alsace region. And they were inspired by the German youth hostel movement, which enjoyed a much longer tradition. The Alsatian youth hostels provided a place where German and French youngsters could meet and express their anti-militarist convictions. And in this way, the Borderland enabled youngsters to contribute considerably to the dissemination of the overall French political ideal of pacifism. So, what I want to say is that these are examples of practices that emerged after Borderland children had engaged with nationalist ideas, and that these practices offered solutions that could be integrated within the policies of the nation-states the children inhabited. Now, all authors, all children in the sources that were used by the authors in the following, they put a decisive factor for the emergence of their creative practices in demography. They always say that they were doing things differently than their parents. So there is a demographic difference. And this, according to me, should not come as a surprise, as the children found themselves at the center of nationalist interests in political programs about the integration of their borderland into the nation state. So I've been granting much attention to what I call this creative solutional practices of borderland children in an attempt to venture beyond this dichotomous dialectic about national practices and non-national practices that is predominant in the individual contributions of the book. Because I tend to present these borderland children also as historical actors, capable of producing various kinds of practices in a place where meaning remains contested. And yet, although borderland children offer creative and context-specific solutions to the way international order had been established in Europe, they never referred to their practices as Europeanizing. It were peace negotiators that held intense discussions about Europeanization, and the various European borderlands that were called into being as a result of these discussions embodied the contradictions that were in lying at the heart of their debates. Borderland children, however, often saw the world through very local glasses, while solving such contradictions through practices that helped to integrate their borderlands into their nation states. Now, some historians have proposed that historians should only use the concept of Europeanization if historical actors